Welcome back. We're in conversation about super economies, India, China, America, and the future of the world. The emerging theater of potential conflict, and Raghav refers to this in his book, the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Do you see a situation where countries in this region, backed by the US or otherwise, would actually go to conflict with China, would actually go to war with China over these bunch of rocky islands, wherever they are, in the East or South China Sea?
There will be a state of confrontation,
sure,
which may or may not lead to a state of conflict.
Okay.
Right. But I want to address your previous question briefly, if I may. Just to point out, I love the Bible. Man really doesn't live by bread alone. And if you have from the Bible, switch immediately to Simon Schama and Citizens, his great understanding of the French Revolution, you come to even the Russian Revolution, you come to this very interesting, almost poignant fact that serf societies don't revolt. The revolution begins after your stomach has started to become full. And China is at the tipping point where the stomach is beginning to get full again.
Sure.
And therefore, the dangers of a full stomach on a society at that curve point are actually much more dangerous than, China is a country where under Mao, 100 million, perhaps, I don't know, we don't know specific figures, but it's estimated, let's say by propaganda, it's 100 million, maybe 50 million. 50 million is not a small number. To die in famine, no revolt, cultural revolution, hailing Mao. But today, 50 million, no way, no system. Now, second point that I'd like to make. China, and this is going to sound absolutely heretical. China was in a better state to manage the transition to democracy before 1991.
Than it is today.
Than it is today.
Why is that?
Because of a fact which everybody seems to ignore. It was in 1992 that after Deng's influence, that the party became the owner of all natural resources in China. Till then, the state owned.
Okay.
Right? After that, he transferred the wealth of China to the party. So today, an oligarchy of 3.5–4%, many of them decaying through the natural process of age, controls and owns China. And this is leading to the great conflicts of corruption and so on, which they are trying to address right now.
Through Xi Jinping.
President Xi Jinping is at the moment really worried not only about corruption, but also about its impact on the geographical unity of China. As you know, he keeps telling his comrades to take a look at what happened in 1991. Now, simultaneously, to come back to your question of conflict, he addresses the question very well in his book. But I think the book was written a little before the joint statement between India and Washington.
When
India and United
Obama
States,
was here.
where the South China Sea was mentioned for the first time. Now, this is a very clear signal being sent to China on the record that while we are very happy to come to terms with you, we are not about conflict. We are trying to ease even confrontation. I believe China is a mature country with a mature leadership. So it will understand all this. But there are lines. The lines are that nothing belongs to, you can convert the internal resources of the country into the party, but you can't control or extend it to the seas.
Sure. Raghav, I mean, there's also the other side of the argument, which is what the Chinese always say. Let's say, for example, the situation with Japan, the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands issue. It really flared up after the then Japanese government decided to purchase those islands from a private family which owned it. And then it was like, it put the Chinese in a position where they had no other choice but to react. It also coincided with the time when Xi Jinping, the leadership transition was happening, so he had to be seen to be taking a firm position. But now, Abe and Xi Jinping have met on the sidelines of APEC. Their militaries are again now talking. The fact that they trade $350 billion, Japan and China, will and should, and has so far, deterred them from going into open confrontation.
The South China Sea is a very interesting place in the sense that every large power needs a backyard. China looks upon it as its backyard. Now, that doesn't mean it owns it, as Akbar said. That doesn't mean that it can do dadagiri there. But it can have disproportionate influence. I think every superpower or super economy will look for that. India needs it in South Asia, and now extended out to Burma and a few other places. We also look for disproportionate influence. America looks for it in Europe and Japan and a bit of Middle East and Asia. So my sense is that China tests the world to say that, listen, this is my backyard and this is my sphere of influence. Give me some more space. And therefore, what was said in the joint statement, and Akbar's absolutely right, the book was written before that, because otherwise I would have certainly picked up on that extremely significant, that India joining issue on the South China Sea in a formal communique and a formal joint declaration with the US president. My sense is that China will get its influence in the South China Sea, influence. I think America and India will allow them a little bit more elbow room there. In return for China remaining much more integrated into global affairs. Just as India will demand and get influence in South Asia.
But let me sort of extend this as a corollary. The way the Chinese perceive the South China Sea or the East China Sea dispute, the way they framed it, is it's a territorial integrity / sovereignty issue. India has its own territorial dispute with China. And frankly, you know, it's not been moving. For the last 10 years since the 2005 agreement, we're seriously not moving. In fact, even when the Prime Minister was there back in May, the issue, there hasn't been any kind of progress on that issue. How does India then view an assertive China and on all these claims it is making in the South China Sea and the East China Sea? And what kind of inferences does India draw from our own pending land dispute with China?
Well, if you look at what even Zhou Enlai was prepared to agree to with Pandit Nehru, or what Deng Xiaoping was prepared to agree with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, is something that the Chinese are no longer willing to agree to with us today. Now, something that Henry Kissinger has written about China, and he's been very simpatico about China, and only lately simpatico about India's growth, is that China has violated Deng Xiaoping's cardinal rule of keeping its head down, not ruffling feathers, until it became a much bigger power than it has already become. So it's not just India's concern. China is surrounded by neighbors who are all concerned about what they consider increasing degrees of Chinese hegemony. Ironically, this is exactly the inflection point where India is leaving a similar past behind of having touchy relations with our neighbors, to actually dramatically improving our relations in South Asia. So now this also impinges on the other question you asked, that how does increased trade and investment impact the threat of discord? It obviously dissipates that threat. If countries are trading together, they're investing in each other's economies, it does help to drive home the point that any pain will be faced by both, not just by one side. But nevertheless, when there is that degree of tension, it does cause concern. Why do you think Japan is so gung-ho about investing in India, despite the biggest Japanese investment being actually in China? Is because that despite all that big investment, there remains some fundamental discord, and so they're looking at diversifying their basket.
The one country that, I mean, Jay said that we have great relations with all our South Asian neighbors except Pakistan. And Raghav mentions that quite extensively in his book, and he reckons that India and America will further sort of close ranks when it comes to the issue of Pakistan. He reckons that Osama's killing, for example, brought India and America together. And in fact, you go a step further to say that India, America, and China would cooperate on taking on Islamist terror. Isn't there a sense of disappointment even today here in India vis-a-vis American sort of recalcitrance, if you will, on Lakhvi, on Hafiz Saeed, the fact that the Indian establishment feels America has not done enough to get the Pakistanis to do more? Do you feel that?
Before we get to America, we have to mention a country which is being lost in the discourse, Vietnam. There was a time when China could play a unilateral game using Pakistan, basically outsourcing the confrontation, at least the nuclear part of it, adding Pakistan. In the last few years, we have actually quietly but quite effectively done a bit of ring fencing ourselves. There is an emerging relationship, strategic relationship between India, Vietnam, Japan, to which America has bought in for the Pacific. And that is something that, well, worries, irritates Beijing a bit. And certainly, I believe that the reaction to that is most keenly asserted by what I call the Pakistan lobby within PLA. After all, PLA and Pakistan have, legitimate, they would have a certain lobby and so on. And they are the ones who, much against Xi Jinping's sort of diplomacy, would create border intrusions, and then the knuckles have to be wrapped and so on. But on the America question, I have a slightly alternative view. What we are seeing vis-a-vis America, and I'm reminded all the time of Matthew Arnold's famous lines. Matthew Arnold, alas, is an unknown poet which probably remain unknown. But he said, one world is dead and the other isn't born. Describing 1850s, the pre-Victorian age.
Okay.
And the Pax Americana, which America has actually controlled or maintained the so-called peace, first in two phases, one up to the collapse of the Soviet Union and then in the post-collapse phase, that is cracking up.
Okay.
Because America doesn't have the ability or the will, really. You need boots on the ground to keep the peace from the Roman Empire downwards.
Okay. Which it doesn't.
Which it doesn't. You run out of time.
I've run out of time, but thank you very much for this fascinating conversation, gentlemen. I don't know if we can hold you to account, because 50 years is a long time from now to actually see if the world panned out the way Raghav Bahl predicted it in 2015. But thank you very much, Raghav Bahl, Jay Panda, and MJ Akbar, for joining us here on this fascinating conversation. If you've been tuned in at home, thanks for your time. I'm Zaka Jacob. We'll catch you again next time. Goodbye.